Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever in our wonderful wide world you're tuning in. It's your old pal, Guardian Enzo, coming to you live on tape from beautiful Higashiyama, Kyoto, and joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host and co-conspirator, Samu, from the wonderful land of Great Britain, if that's a land. I think it is. How you doing, Samu?
I'm doing well. I mean, there are plenty of lands there. There's England,
That's
Scotland.
true. Yeah, Ireland, Northern Ireland.
Exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, I'm good. I'm looking forward to this discussion. This is also one of these ones where I'm like, okay, this is a tick box on Enzo's to talk about
It is
series.
absolutely that. And so, yes, in case, if you're listening or watching on YouTube, I can't imagine you don't know, but this is, in fact, My Taste is Better Than Yours, the podcast where Samu and I talk about various mangas and other things about mangas and anime sometimes too. And tonight we're talking about, yes, that's a spoiler, it's evening when I'm recording this in Japan. Toshokan no Daimajutsushi. It's Magus of the Library. This is one of my white whales. One of those manga that I've considered for years and years to be one of the absolute pillars of the ongoing manga landscape. A series I love. I love unreservedly. It's fair to say. We've tackled most of those at this point, but not all of them. But this is definitely one of the ones that was definitely a big outlier that I really wanted to talk about. And these are always a bit alarming when we do them because it's like you want your co-host to like it as much as you do, and they never do, but you hope they at least like it. And I felt a fair sense of confidence with this, just as I did with Primal Gods in Ancient Times, that Samu would have a pretty positive take on Mages of the Library. But I guess we'll find out in the next 60 to 75 minutes. To do a little housekeeping, the mangaka here is Mutsu Izumi. The series is published in Good Afternoon. It is a seinen manga. Started publishing in 2017. So basically, it's some would say a reminiscent of Arabian Nights. I think that is the official manga synopsis, does make that illusion. I don't find it that strong myself, but it is definitely has an Arabian element to it to a certain extent. And it follows a young boy named Theo Fumis, who resembles an elf, but he's not an elf because there are no elves in this world. And he grows up in a small remote village with his older sister, and he loves books, but he's not supposed to be allowed to read books because of his social standing and his race, too, for that matter. And so he encounters a librarian named Sedona, and from the greatest library in the world. And one thing leads to another, and Theo eventually goes to the big city to train to be a Kafna, a one of the people who work at this great library. And so many other things happen along the way, but that's more or less the bare bones synopsis of it. And as usual, I'll turn it over to you, Samu. Do you have any general thoughts you want to give us on Mages of the Library before we jump into the specifics?
Yeah, I can't believe like this is the worst series that Enzo's
Aha,
recommended.
aha.
Um, I fear for myself if it actually was how I felt. This is a very dense series, filled with details. I've said to him as I was reading it, I was like, "This feels like I'm reading a novel. This is up there with things like Oku or the Succession Contest arc in Hunter x
Yeah.
Hunter." Which, spoiler, I love both of them a lot, a lot.
Mm.
So that wasn't really a complaint. That was more of just like this takes some brain power to if you want to absorb everything that it's throwing at you. From the jump, I got the sense that the way that the world building is handled here, the focus that it has as well, it does feel more like a fantasy novel than it does like a fantasy manga to me in some ways. Yeah, I have lots of thoughts and feelings, and I'm sure we're going to start from the very beginning. So, this series talks about a lot. This series covers a lot of topics. Yeah, I'm curious to get into it.
Well, I agree with you. It is incredibly dense. It has what some might derisively call wall o text moments occasionally. I wouldn't put it quite on the succession arc level, but uh, it does have a lot of dialogue and sometimes a lot of written dialogue too. It's not. It's a series where when I'm reading a chapter, I often have to read. I have to read panels two or three times and just kind of go back and say, okay, I want to take that in again, and because not only is there a lot going on just on the superficial level, there's also a lot of subtextual stuff, and there is a mystery element to this series too. And you know, Mutsu Izumi is dropping hints about what's really going on here all through the series, and if you try to breeze through it too fast, you're not going to pick up on those. And so, for the record, the series is still ongoing with no obvious indication that it's anywhere close to being finished. And so, there are a lot of interesting theories there about where it could be going and what we might really have been looking at for the last 55 chapters and 8 years. But um, let's talk about, as much as I hate the word, it is true that there are critics of this series who use this word about it, that this series is too woke, that it's one of the most woke manga, that it's politically correct. I would say, from my perspective, Magus at the Library is a series that swims against the current of mainstream Japanese thinking in many ways, and that it is not afraid to use the events it depicts as a commentary on both history and on the present in the real world, as great fantasy so often does. So before we get into the specifics, which I think will take us into spoiler territory, so let's not do that. But in broad terms, how do you feel about the kind of criticism that the series has taken for some of the positions it takes, and just generally its viewpoint and how you feel it, what kind of statement it's making about the world? Sorry, that's a big question.
I mean, what I will say, I've not been too privy to the inner workings of discussions of the series, one way or the other. You know, all I just knew that that was a label attached to the series, that it was a very woke fantasy manga, which I in itself didn't take of it one way or the other. I was just like, okay, and then upon reading it, I'm like, I understand in terms of the social commentary it focuses on all the many real world topics that it makes part of its narrative and its world in a conscious and intentional way. I'm like, I'm not shocked that that is one of the initial defining ways that people discuss this series. I think it has its own lane of what it's trying to say, and I do agree with you that it does go against the tide of, I suppose, expectations of a fantasy manga, fantasy anime, anything in this sort of realm. I don't think it's alone in that sort of perspective that it has, but I think it absolutely wears it on its sleeve. And I think Mutsu Izumi does not hold back and focusing on those topics in a way that probably reflects on her worldview, but I think also allows her to discuss key topics in ways that allows different point of views within the series to come out. So I think it is doing a lot, and I could get why some people would be like, not for me. Thankfully, I'm not that
Yeah,
person,
thankfully I'm not
but
either.
I already want to go into the specifics,
Yeah.
but I'll save that. Yes.
So yeah, I think you're right. It's not alone in being a series that takes these positions. However, I do think it is quite unusual in the extent to which they're integral to the story itself. It's not just like a passing aside, let's make a social commentary here. Basically, the social commentary is the story with Magus of the Library. It's the whole foundation of the entire series is its view of society and culture and racism and diversity and all these other things. You can't separate it because basically the whole story is built around that. And I will also say another area where I think it does, if not stand alone, stand out at least, even among series that are of a similar bent is the comprehensiveness with which it looks at the ails plaguing human society. It doesn't just like specialize in one area and let's talk about this. You name it, this theme is important in the series. It's, and so industrialization, environmentalism, sexual politics, animal rights, pretty much everything. Every it's got a viewpoint on just about everything. And what I will say, with once before we get into the specifics, is it does not take a one size fits all approach and say if only everyone felt this way, everything would be perfect. It acknowledges the difficulties that arise when people of different cultures intermingle and people have to coexist in a world, and it doesn't belittle those challenges in any way, shape, or form, or suggest that they should be run away from. It says that there's something that we have to accept, and that we have to deal with them. At the center of all this maelstrom, of course, is Theo Fumis, who we meet as quite a young lad. He's well, I don't know how old is he, like 11 or 12 probably when we meet him. And he's already working like in a construction job, and so he's very physically strong, and he's poor. He grows up in a poor village. He loves books, but is not expected to read books, as I said earlier, because of who he is and what he is. And so then there's something much darker and deeper that happens to the race of people he belongs to, but we won't get into that right now. What are your general feelings about Theo as a main character? Now, sharp-eared and strong-memoried listeners will remember that when we did our 2025 best of episode, I picked Theo as my best manga character of 2025. So my feelings about him are pretty clear based on that. But let's have you, Samu, weigh in a little bit on Theo as a protag.
Yes, I knew that you loved Theo, and I can tell that Theo is. This is an Enzo character. There are a couple of Enzo characters in here where I'm like, yep, I know that this is right up his alley. What I will say, to get a negative out of the way, relative negative, I do think the first chapter of the series is the weakest. It's not bad by any stretch. There was something about it where I was just not sold on what it was doing, how it was depicting its story. I think it kind of maybe fell into excessive world building from the jump that is quite common in fantasy novels. Now, I've learned to love the world building that it has. It has even these metatextual details as well that I think add to the character of the series. But I think I wasn't sold on Theo right from the jump. It took me a little bit, but on the whole, I think he is a cute little cinnamon boy of a character who you just cannot help but root for. I think maybe my reservation in his introduction was like, okay, you're really like hammering down the point you're trying to make about the sort of life he has, the suffering he has, in a way that maybe is the very, very first impression and with the intensity which it was done. I was like, tonally, that didn't work for me as much. But yes, I think Theo is he's one of those cases of like the ideal character for this sort of series to operate. His pureness, his an occasion naivety, but also his ability to adapt and his willingness to learn. The other part as well is his conviction to not hate someone. I think that's quite a bold character trait that sticks throughout his whole journey.
And there are people who give him plenty of reason, believe me. But his journey has some commonalities with Thorfinn from Vinland Saga. He comes to his enlightenment in a different way than Thorfinn does, but I think they end up in a fairly similar worldview place. I see something, and I'm not prepared to say this is just how it is. I'm prepared to say this is how it should be. And people will say it's impossible. That's not how it is. And, I made this comment about Thorfinn. It takes people who are willing to take what people say is impossible and try to do it anyway. because even though they usually fail most of the time, uh, they end up moving the goalposts a little bit in the right direction in the process of failing. So it takes people who are willing to do the impossible in order to make the impossible possible, even if they're not the ones who achieve it. And I think Theo and Thorfinn are both people who fall under that umbrella, in my opinion. Um, the world building, again, it's there's a lot of different cultural influences here. um, there's also a very interesting usage of the narrator role, where you would think, oh, it's Thorfinn, he's the protagonist, but it's a little bit different than that, and we'll get into more details of how that works when we get into the spoiler section. But how do you feel about the way the series uses the narrator function in I think a pretty interesting and a pretty novel way?
Yes, like I said, the metatextual like details of the story, I was like, oh, this is very different from how this could have been. A very atypical way of it being told. It's a story within a story, and you get this. It, even from the first chapter, it says the manga is based on a novel by Sophie Schwimm, and I'm like, okay, this is really weird. Fine. I googled Sophie Schwimm. I was like, okay, this is not a real
I
person.
did the
Fine.
same thing. I did the same thing.
I was confused for a minute. That I love how that plays out. Something like, if I was to compare it to the series we just talked about, which is Bleach. Bleach has no overarching narrator, which is part of its character. But this one, the overarching narrator is so part of the character. This like the hints it gives to what is going to happen, this knowingness of the author. You feel like you're being led along as the story is playing out. Yeah, I love that.
Mhm.
I love the story within a story structure that it has. Some of my favorite like fantasy, like sci-fi stories have that, where it's quite rare, but to have the quote unquote author of the story be a character within
Mhm.
is a very cool
And
concept.
not only that, though, the story within the story is a story about telling stories, because one of the many major themes of Magus is a love of fiction, a love of the novel, a love of storytelling, and how fiction and how novels can can teach us about the real world. And so it has this, it's working on this meta level, multiple levels, really, which I think is really fascinating. And it is a series about the love of books as much as it is about anything. And especially, though, especially fiction, especially novels. One of the themes here is in the story is how people who don't understand the importance of fiction, who deride fiction as being trivial, how much they're missing. You know, how much they're missing out on something beautiful and something powerful and something meaningful. That's a blind spot.
Hmm.
But so the world building is very interesting. Some of the language, some of the terminology she uses, there's influences from things like the Aztecs and Native American tribes, and but overall, would you agree that the main aesthetic here is like Central Asian, Middle Eastern kind of for the most part?
Yeah, it's definitely not like Eurocentric sort of fantasy series like I think is quite
But
common
not
in
Japanese either.
both. Yeah, true. It's not Japanese either, but I think that sort of European point of view inspired fantasy from like Western authors is obviously very popular. But I also do think Japanese fantasy authors use that as their point of reference as
Yeah.
well, which then gets like translated and changed into their way of telling that sort of story. This one definitely feels like it's pulling from different influences. Yeah, I feel that. And then to your previous point, I think what I do really appreciate about this series is its choice of what it focuses on. I'm a big fantasy reader. It's weird because my favorite fantasies don't take place on the battlefield. They don't take place when people are fighting. I love a cool magic system. I love everything that can be associated with that. But like my favorite fantasy series are either ones that are heavy on the political intrigue or just feel like they're telling the story of something within that world that feels really, really believable and also can have high stakes without immediately jumping to, okay, and then they took swords to each other and then they killed each other.
Hmm.
uh, the fact that this focuses on this organization of essentially librarians within this world, the importance that has within the structure of this world, the details it goes into of seeing their day-to-day life, what the class does, everything about that, rather than, it still does have those classic fantasy elements of you feel something is brewing, danger is on the horizon. Occasionally something will happen which feels more archetypical, like an action scene or something, but the main focus is always on this particular organization, this structure, and I appreciate the like dedication to sticking to that as the point of view within this world, rather than getting lost in some big conflict which everyone becomes a part of in a more like archetypical way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, I agree. I tend to love that sort of fantasy. I'm a huge fantasy reader, have been since I was a little kid. And this does have the pedigree of a great fantasy novel. It really does. It, you described the first chapter, which you feel, and I, to an extent, I agree with you. It plays out in broader terms than most of the rest of the series does, and in laying out what's going on with Theo when he is, in his village and what he has to deal with in terms of racism and all these other things. I would kind of argue that it's an intentional misdirection more than a kind of a natural growth of the writer. I think she's deliberately trying to throw you off her scent. And she's, so I think you probably read that first chapter and thought you had a pretty good grasp on where the series was going. And at some point, you probably came to the realization, oh, this is something different than I initially expected it to be. To the extent that that's true, and maybe you'll tell me it's not true at all, but if it is, what was the point of the story where you started to realize that maybe this was going in a different direction than you initially expected?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I felt like the first chapter focused on like these very clear points of racism that he suffers and how downbeaten he is, and it felt maybe a bit more on the nose as the rest of the first volume played out, which is almost like the prologue of this first act. I was by that point I was like, okay, I get the vision here. So it was the difference between the first to last chapter of the first volume, pretty much.
Okay, yeah, kind of. We're gonna edging towards spoiler territory, but I don't think this is a spoiler because this is something that is apparent early in the series. But one of the interesting things is that Izumi does is she has three characters, seemingly unrelated characters, all named Fumis, which I find to be an interesting choice. Do you have any notions on why you think she did that?
Well, there's the famous orphanage,
Yes,
and
yes.
if I'm
But
not
he,
if
but
I'm not
Theo does not
wrong,
come from the Fumis orphanage, though.
yeah, I'm not 100% on that. I did notice that there was quite a few people of that surname. I did remember when they did show some point the orphanage, there was like three children that were there, and one of them had those elf ears in the same way his did.
Mm.
So I don't know if he is part of it, and that's not being clarified or explained in that way. I think it's quite typical as well in fantasy of like having that sort of realism of like, okay, in this sort of world there would be people with similar names or repeated names, things like that. But I'm sure if it's happening intentionally, there's going to be some connection made uh, at some point.
Yeah, it does feel like a Chekhov's gun, doesn't it? I guess that's the point I'm making. Yeah, I guess that is a spoiler in the sense that we still don't know. I'm going to jump into the spoiler here, unless you have something more you want to talk about in the non-spoiler section.
Go for it.
One of the things that happens in this series, one of the defining events in the world building in Magus of the Library, is basically a genocide event. And there is a book what are they called? The Black Tome, or the black text, or something like that.
The Black
The
Book.
Black Book.
Yeah, Black Text.
Yeah, and basically, it makes an argument for why Theo's people are an inferior race and should be wiped off the face of the earth. Um, and It's obviously now an infamous book, but the reality is, when this book was written, many people took it seriously, and as a result, there was a genocide. And the original author of the book, we're told, is so, we're fully in spoiler section now, just for the record, mortified by the result of what he's written, that the effect it's had in the real world, that he commits suicide rather than living with the guilt of. So there's some. This is left to interpretation as to, he's not a major character in the book, but it's left to interpretation why he wrote this if that was not his intention. It's clear that it was not his intention on some level, or at least that it spiraled into something that he never intended. And then when Theo gets to basically, again, Theo is given the opportunity. This character Sedona, who I mentioned earlier, is really the one who makes this possible. But basically, these are these people from the central library who do travel around to the villages, to the countryside. Theo's talent and his intelligence catches her attention. Maybe something else about him, we don't know, catches her attention. He ends up getting the opportunity to go to the big city and take the exam to become a Kafna, which is someone who works for the central library in the capital. And but other people, among this, there's a particular, I'm thinking of a character named Natika, who is abjectly and overtly racist about Theo's people, in fact, and argues to his face that she thinks that his people should have been wiped off the face of the planet. Um, so you don't see this kind of thing presented in a serious.
Can I just
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just correct one
Oh,
thing?
what did I get wrong? Sorry.
I think. Do you mean Medina?
Oh, Medina. Yeah.
Attica is shiny forehead.
Oh, yeah. That's right. Medina. Yeah. Sorry. So where do you? So I don't know what question I'm asking you is, but what is your general take on the role racism plays in Magus of the Library, both as a motivating factor specifically for Theo, and as an overlying theme of the story? It's obviously important.
Okay. Yeah, it's very important. It's a big part of the series, recurring throughout. I appreciate that it is such a focus. I think kudos to Mutsu Izumi for even honing in on it as much as she does and making it part of the key world building. I mean, all of the 7 different races that make up this world, there are various different crossovers in its history of other people enslaving others, racism between different groups of people because of this idea that there was this big calamitous event, and there has been peace because there was this agreement. For once that was resolved, there was an agreement among the heroes afterwards, and the worlds were split off into these autonomous regions. Now, I think for the most part, it's done in a very, very intelligent way, which makes me dwell on it a lot as I'm reading it. There are times where I think, not that it makes mistakes, but also I'm like, that maybe the optics of it can sometimes be, I can imagine them being challenging. And already at this point, I'm excluding people who are there are people who, if they see someone who is not like a white man is a main character, they're like, this is diversity, forcing diversity in the series. This is a very diverse series from the jump. So that part of it is not something that I would put up for debate. I think there are maybe elements in the beginning where, because Theo, he's he's mixed race between
Yes, he is.
These
he's
two
mixed.
people.
Yes.
In the place that he does live, the Hyron Autonomous Region, that does seem to be more Middle Eastern, some influences there. So basically every other character around him in that initial part of the series is quite dark skinned or like brown skinned. He is pale, blonde hair, little elf ears, sort of character design. So he sticks out visually in that way. Um, and it does hammer a lot that those people have their racist feelings towards Theo. There was a point where I was like, okay, it makes complete sense within the narrative of the story how it's been structured, but there is maybe something with the optics of having all these brown skinned characters hitting on the one like pale white boy in the story at that early point in the series that had a bit of a question mark in my head. um I think as the series has gone on, however, and like I said, there is a crossover in all these different people doing horrible things to each other. So you do get the sense of the full picture of like, okay, it's not just that case. That's not the type of racism that the series is about. There's many different examples how it happens. I think maybe just because that very specific experience of Theo was happening, that was the one where I was like, but as a whole, yeah, I think it's done with really, really good intentions, and I think only serves to create fascinating character introductions, especially when it has these characters like Medina, who comes from a very, very negative, racist place. And like I said, Theo was a forgiving type of person in ways that he doesn't need to or should be. Whenever Theo has these interactions with these people, I can't wait to see how this is going to flourish and change dramatically as a result of his convictions.
Well,
That
yeah,
was a big answer. I don't know if that made sense.
yeah. That's it. Is that he not only has convictions, but he has conviction in his convictions. He firmly believes that the way to change people is to continue to be yourself and to be an example of something different than what they expect. And what I would say about racism as a theme in Magus, and I don't think it's the central theme, but I think it's like one B. I think it's about endemic institutional racism. It's not about victimization. It's not like making parallels to the Holocaust specifically or to the Rwandan genocide or anything like that. It's about this instinctual, like almost DNA level kind of antipathy that people seem to have for those who look different than they are. Um, and the differences in beliefs that people have in the series are as important as the differences in their appearance, of course. And what I would argue, though, as much as this is all very, very important, and listen, let's not sugarcoat it. Magus of the Library is a full throated, outspoken advocate of diversity. It absolutely is. I would never and could never deny that. It definitely argues that we need to get past this shit, uh, but it doesn't make the case that diversity fixes problems. Only that it kind of sets us to a place where we can start looking for solutions. That we accept that diversity is a thing. It's real. It's part of the human condition, and the only thing we're doing by denying it is isolating ourselves and making our condition worse. But for all that, I think I would make the argument that the dominant number one underlying theme of Magus of the Library is three words: knowledge is power. And I think that's the central theme, is because you have people. Uh, we have this library which is quite powerful, which is quite influential, but it also has extremely powerful and influential opponents. And the really the way I see the series attacking this issue is that looking at knowledge as a commodity, and that the people who are in power are trying to reserve that commodity, and the way they seek to maintain their status, the way they seek to maintain their control over everything, every other resource, is by controlling the resource of knowledge. And that if they keep that resource from being spread too much among the lower lying classes, or the other races, if that's their viewpoint in some cases, then the easier it is for them to maintain control of the other resources that they want to maintain control of. So to me, even more than diversity or racism or environmentalism or love of books and all these other themes, I think fundamentally, if you broke Magus of the Library down to its core essential mitochondrial DNA, I think knowledge is power is at the heart of the conflict in the series. And I wonder if you'd like to weigh in on that thesis.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think that, and also like we touched on earlier, which is the power of stories, of fiction. In reading this gives me a feeling of like, damn, I want to read a really good book right now, which I think is the success of what the message is trying to push across. So yeah, it captures the feeling of that, but I think the intentional thought it has behind these big topics of, like you said, knowledge is power, and then it focuses on things like censorship, like this library which is at the center of this. It's funny because there's like wrinkles to it where there are people within it who admit that there are genuine ways that people could be skeptical of it because they have authority over what is published, the power of words, the control over the stories that are seen by people, because they want to achieve peace between everyone. uh, and then that brings up this conversation of like they are enacting censorship in that way to maintain that. I think the use of misinformation
Mm,
by the opposing factions feels very relevant. Um, there's lots of different religions as well in the series, and I think it depicts them in a way which is fair and showing how people of a different background would think from a different point of view, but also showing that the consequences of oppression that could happen from that sort of perspective or indoctrination or not being able to see beyond what you have been raised to be. I mean, it was never like a negative for me in the series, but it does talk about these subjects in a very like modern way. It never really broke the immersion of like this is a fantasy series for me, because it was refreshing that it was such a DNA of the identity and the structure of the series. But it was notable that I was like, damn, we're using a lot of, I don't know what to say, buzzwords or like very relevant topics that make sense to us living in 2026. I mean, even in the later chapters, like we see capitalism being talked about as well. So it's very direct in the things it's focusing on.
mm.
So yeah, I suppose I was curious as well if you ever thought that it became too modern that broke the immersion for you.
No, because I think the point it's making is that we're kidding ourselves if we think we're the first people that have ever confronted these problems. I think the message is that
I agree.
history is a cycle, and that we are dealing throughout the history of like human civilization. We're dealing with the same problems over and over again, which repackage themselves for the times in which they exist. And I think that's why these problems seem very modern and very relevant, because they're the same problems we're dealing with in the real world. It's just that they're not exclusive to the modern world. They're the same. They're fundamentally the same. They're just they look differently because the times are different. And so that's my take on that. So that's why it never breaks the immersion for me, because that's I think the messaging, and I think frankly it's very effective in that messaging. I would argue. So another element of this is the Kafna exam. You have to take the Kafna exam, and then if you pass the Kafna exam, you become an apprentice or a student, basically an apprentice Kafna, which is so basically it's you can broadly, if you were going to classify it as a subgenre thing, it's something like a Magic Academy kind of a thing, except they're learning how to be librarians in a sense. So all of these kids, and they range. The thing about the Kafna exam is that they range from like 10 or 11 years old up to in their 30s. People from all different ages. There's no age limit on who can apply. There's no race limit on who can apply. There's no gender. It's just basically anyone, if you have what it takes, you can apply. But the net result of that is we have a group of people coming together, most of whom are in their like early teens, you would say, so that broadly in that age group, not, but that's like the main age group. And these people are all thrown together and they all come from these different races, mixed race as Theo is, different religions, different customs. And it's like, okay, these are your roommates, deal with it, get along. So that really a lot of the main body of the story is these mostly kids uh, learning to deal with each other, learning to deal with uh, some of them being on their own for the first time, but also dealing with having to live with someone who has to get up and pray in four directions at certain times of the night, and all these different things that are going on. The people learning to accept each other's customs and not be driven crazy by each other, and then they kind of end up driving each other crazy in the way that kids drive each other crazy, just the nature of their differences in personality. And it winds up being mostly that defines the relationships more than the background of the person involved. So it's basically who they are becomes more important than what they are, but it doesn't start out that way. And I think that evolution happens over the course of many, many, many chapters. In fact, I would say over half the series is that's an ongoing theme, is watching the evolution of as these kids, as the experience of this changes them. So I wonder how, if you would kind of share how you feel the series succeeds in that side of it, as like a school story, as an academy story of these kids dealing with all these new experiences and new people.
I think one thing as well that I really like in setting that answer up, we do get from the start that the Kafnas are majority women. I can't believe it was 10-1 or some ratio to that range of men to women, but it's not a case of like, oh, this is like just a gender flip society where women are in charge, which like you can tell a story from that perspective that could be very interesting. This one is more like this profession of being a Kafna, of being essentially this glorified, upgraded librarian, and its importance it has in maintaining this balance in the world. That comes from, there are a lot of men in this society who can be scholars. Women still suffer the sexism and can't be that. So this is then the next profession for them, which is an explanation why there's so many young girls that join for the exam and are part of the class. But also, and for so many of them, it isn't just an easy thing of like, okay, well, you're a girl, so you'll become a kafna. Like, for a girl for that to be her goal, she kind of is going out of the way to, in some cases, we see in them, like ostracizing herself from the expectations of being a woman, of like not being the wife, the bride for someone else, for like taking that upon yourself for a career driven like direction. So I love that how that establishes some of the relationships that Theo has with them, where Theo has this optimism, being like, okay, they're girls, but like he doesn't really care. He's just gonna it's what he wants to be, and to him, he was just very pure in his intentions. And then he comes across people who are like, oh no, but you don't understand it. Like for me as a girl, if I fail at this test, I'm like a failure to my family. I'm gonna have to go back in shame for even trying to be this ambitious. And instead of that being a source of conflict between them, feels like continued ability to understand someone else's perspective and like
Mm.
reach out and like not even just convince them, but just to understand each other. And then from there, they like get to a very healthy relationship with one another. We see it so many times. I mean, can I shout out specific characters?
Absolutely,
Is this a
absolutely. I
good
was
time
just
to?
about to head there. Yeah.
Okay, good. I mean, you mentioned Natka earlier. She's the less racist one. I don't think she was actually that racist at all. She was misinformed and she was very up herself. She was the one who was involved in the exam with them, with Theo and Olga, I believe her name is, the
Mm-hmm.
other mixed race girl. She also mentioned something which was about like a almost like a diversity quota. She's like, oh, but like if you get in, like it's because It's because like you're mixed race, you're different from us. And then I think from her that ignorance, but also Theo's inability to know any better, creates that bit of conflict. But her then later on in the series being like, "Oh, actually, I'm sorry that I said that. I was misinformed. I didn't realize that was the case." Compare that with someone like Medina, who, in some ways, I don't know if this is a crazy thing to say. In some ways, Medina is like maybe my favorite character in the series because she is introduced in such a negative way, and you're like, I have every reason to dislike this girl. Everyone in this class has every reason to do so, but I can see that the journey that's going to happen with her character. And I suppose I just get really compelled with characters, so I know have to go on that degree of a rediscovery of who they are. I think the series as a whole does a good job of not being like, okay, if you once believe something, that doesn't necessarily mean that defines you for the rest of your life. If you're someone who is willing to change and adapt in a positive way, you can be given the grace to do that. And like Theo is the representation of that.
Mhm.
And all the times where she's horribly, violently racist towards him in her rhetoric, and it takes a good while before she gets to that point of being convinced, I suppose, that her perspective is warped by her own self-hatred because of the expectations or lack of that her family puts on her.
Mhm.
I think she's like one of the most fascinating characters. That was not an easy journey, but one that whenever there was that interaction between them, I was totally hooked. And then there's other fun ones like Mihona. She's a girl that Theo finds on the way to the capital, and she just wants to be like the main character of her own life. She's quite goofy and fun, and the like things that she comes up with, and like when they both join together and they have that look of like, don't mention that you know me. I have to make this. I have to be the mysterious character that everyone is compelled by. Yeah, I think she's cute. And then someone like Aya as well. She's a clear standout. I think her and Theo's relationship, what he's brought out in her, has just been sweet, so sweet to see.
The thing with Theo is, he has a very, in a way, when the series starts, it more so than later on, but he has a sort of a very sheltered worldview. Is in spite of how hard his youth was, he has a very sheltered worldview. So he comes off sometimes as insensitive in his interactions with his fellow trainees because the kind of shit that they have to deal with in their life, it just never occurs to him that people would have to deal with that shit because it makes no sense to him. So it never occurs to him. So it's like, and I think it's kind of hard for them sometimes to realize that he legitimately, just the idea of the kind of discrimination or whatever it is they're dealing with, it would never even occur to him because it just makes no sense. So that's kind of a reverse discrimination, if you like, with Theo sometimes. He has to learn that the world is full of ignorance and stupidity and all these things and all these other challenges that people have to deal with. And that, that kind of defines their experience. It's certainly some of the things. I mean, Medina is not a likable person by any stretch of the imagination, but she is fascinating and she is a product of her background. And I think in many ways, very realistically, the characters in this series are products of their background. And I think that what Theo's role eventually winds up being to a large extent, he can always be the one that brings two other people together. He's the one that isn't weighed down with this great weight of cynicism and prejudice and all these other things that all these other people are carrying with them. It doesn't hit him the same way. So he's kind of like free of all that baggage, and as a result of being free of all that baggage, he can be the one that is like the common thread between two other people. Which I think is a very important role that he will continue to play as the story progresses. The other thing, so I would say you are correct in that the world of the Kafna is overwhelmingly female, and you're right. I think it is 9 women or 9 girls to every boy. I think there are 3 boys in Theo's trainee class, and they're all roommates because they're the only three. So it's Theo and another boy named Alv, who is
He's such an Enzo character.
the
I feel like his
noble.
personality is just right up your lane.
Well, I like him because he doesn't come at you with like racism or any of these other obvious kind of obnoxious things that a lot of the characters do. He's just kind of he's very in his own lane, and he's very kind of sure of who he is and who he wants to be. But he does he does he's an eminence front kind of a person. He does have a big kind of a pretense he puts up to deal with his own insecurities, which I think are very I think very believable. The other roommate is Sumomo, who the interesting thing, Sumomo is sort of like very outgoing and friendly. But the thing with Sumomo is he grew up in a family, I think, with 8 sisters or something like that, and so he has, and his mother is a very important, influential person within the library. So in fact, there's a very funny scene where after they get to the at the point where they're being assigned and going out into their specific divisions, he warns Theo, "Be careful of my mom. She's scary." But so he's kind of like he's just glad to be around other guys. That's like the most important thing for him. And then the other kind of standout character that we have to talk about in Theo's Kafna class is Sophie Schwimm. Um, and what do you know, Sophie? Where do you begin with Sophie? Sophie's 35. So she's way older than anybody else in this trainee group. We get a look at her past in, I think, an absolute. I know you love a good flashback arc. I think her flashback arc is absolutely, it's a cracker. It's fantastic. But of course, we already know the name Sophie Schwimm before we ever know the face Sophie Schwimm, because this is Kafna of the Wind, based on Kafna of the Wind by Sophie Schwimm, is something we've seen over and over again since very early in the series. And then all of a sudden, when we get to the academy, eventually we meet Sophie Schwimm. What was your initial reaction, kind of just like your instinctive initial reaction when Sophie Schwimm walks onto the page and is suddenly a character in the story?
It's hilarious because I don't know how many pages before, but I want to say it was like maybe a chapter or two beforehand. I was like, okay, we keep saying this name. I wonder how this actually plays into the narrative. I wonder if we'll ever meet Sophie Schwimm. Like maybe she'll be a reveal at the end of the series. And then I just remember turning a page and being like, bam, oh my god, wait, that was Sophie? Because she was introduced a little bit before that as part of the group, but always like a question mark beside her. So very intentional in not revealing her name and her
Yes,
identity.
yes, yes,
So when
yes.
that came, I was like, actually, this is the perfect place for her to be introduced in terms of how the reader, how I felt curious, the curiosity building up in me about who this character potentially could be. So to actually have it be presented in that way, and then we do our kind of drip fed bits and pieces of her life um, from that point. Uh, yeah, she's an interesting character who puts on a front of herself, but I think we learn about her being like one of the famous novelists in the series as well,
Mm,
the
mm.
novelist of the like children's story that is Theo's major inspiration and like one of his favorites. So yeah, every time we get a bit more of her life, I'm like, I can't wait to see how this actually builds into the Kafna of the Wind.
She's kind of like the personification of the whole love of storytelling and fiction too. I mean, she sort of
Mm.
represents that whole element of the story, kind of a romantic sense, I would say. I love Sophie. I love Sophie kind of globally, and I love her locally. I think as a concept, I think she's great. I think the way she was introduced is fantastic, and the role she plays in the story, which is so difficult to parse. It's so complicated, and I love the mystery attached to that. But I also think she's really, really interesting as a person. And the more we get to know about her, the other thing with Sophie is, she has to write as a man because it was, it would not be accepted for a woman in her position to be writing novels. So plenty of women in Europe are quite familiar with that scenario. So, um, and all, which is all very ironic in that probably the first novel ever written was openly written by a woman, which is The Tale of Genji.
The fact that Kafna the Wind is by Sophie Schwimm within the narrative builds up to this probably revelation that she is going to write truthful to her identity at some point. So, in the ways that I'm
Yes,
also curious how clearly there's a question mark to almost everyone else apart from her. We know her fate. We know where she will, for the most part, be able to be by the end of the story. Yeah, anytime we're going to get more of her that's building up to this, I'm like, yeah.
she's one of my favorites, absolutely. But let's talk about Sedona, who is a very, very important
Okay.
character in the story in many ways. For the record, Sedona, in the official words of the mangaka, is the gender is in the mangaka's words, it's free. The audience can assign whatever gender to Sedona that they prefer. It's not specified by the author. So just for the record. And I know I have seen many people who assumed Sedona was male, many people who assumed Sedona was female. So
Hmm.
if that was what the author was going for, if that's what Izumi was going for, she did a good job. Um, so let's talk about the book with no name. The book with no name is a very interesting uh, MacGuffin in Magus' library. Theo finds this book as a little boy. He protects it from the rain. The book belongs to Sedona, but Sedona gives it to Theo and says, I'm going to loan you this book. You can hang on to it until some indefinite point in the future. This book, were at various times, I think in the whole course of the series, I could be wrong about this, but I think the book with no name is only specifically referred to maybe 4 or 5 times. I could be wrong about that. But there are hints that whatever is in this book, and we never get too much detail of what's in this book, but we get the idea from Theo himself, not least, that whatever is in this book could shake the very foundations of this whole world that this series spends so much time building. That it could bring it, I think, shake it to its very foundations. Um, and so Sedona is important for the reason that she gives Theo this book, clearly knowing that whatever is in this book is something dangerous and important. But there's also there's a group, an anti-library group, the Mask Society, that comes up later on. We don't know what role, whether they know about this book, exactly what their interaction is with this. We don't know what Sedona's endgame is. So talk to me a little bit about, because it's not really spoiler territory, because at this point we don't really know with where the manga is now. So all we're doing is speculating. How do you place Sedona in the story, and how do you place the book with no name in the story?
There's details that we still have to understand about what actually went down, but clearly it's going to be enough to like shake the foundations of this world. And I think the other part about this is, why did Sedona leave it with Theo?
Yes, that's my
And
next question.
how what is Sedona's plan with this? I mean, one of the ways that the narrative voice is used in a very, very striking way partway through the series is when Theo and Sedona have a sort of reunion once they're at the library together. And then Sophie, as the narrator, says, like, this is the beginning of what will be these two forces against each other. Then immediately you're like, okay, so Sedona's the villain then. Like, something is going to happen that leads up to this. And then from that point, you have this air of unknowingness of not trusting this current of it feels wrong, maybe this aspect of their relationship. What is Sedona trying to do with Theo? I also do wonder if it's going to be that clean cut. Like Sedona is the villain and Theo is the hero. I mean, that is what I expect. And how this mass society is also being used as this opposing force to the Kafna in the library.
Yeah.
Whenever Theo has unknowingly had interactions with them, they've not been negative. Like he's not disagreed with what they said entirely, or he's spoken to these people and there's been some common ground reached, like he does with everyone. And then you also see that they don't appear to be on Sedona's side. She is still like defending what is the library. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's so many question marks. I don't know if it's going. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I am fascinated.
Yeah, I do think it's very interesting. I also just one last thought on Sedona is that the what we keep seeing this title of Sophie's book is Kafna of the Wind. And one of the things about Sedona is that she's extremely skilled in wind magic. So there is, I think, a reasonable, at least theory could be surmised that who is the Kafna of the Wind? Well, maybe it's Sedona, because she is the most powerful wind magician who's a prominent figure in the story. So that's an interesting kind of twist on that too. Um, I don't necessarily see Sedona becoming the out and out villain, but I don't think. Again, you're right. We don't know. There's still much to play out here. Okay, before we jump into the last section here, which is obviously recommendations and scores and all that, I just want to talk about one very interesting, what I think is a very interesting recent arc in the manga, which is where it literally, like literally, samples The Boy Who Cried Wolf, the old fairy tale, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. And there's a very there's a man who is literally basically made to wear a wolf mask because he keeps talking about a disaster that's going to happen if a library is built. And what Theo joins this liaisons group. That's the division of the library he joins, the liaisons, which is really perfect for him. And he goes off with his partners to help set the stage for building a library. The mayor of the town is gung ho for it. He wants the library. A lot of the people in the town don't want the library because they think that getting kids reading is just going to cause trouble. It's kind of a standard dichotomy that you'd see. But there's this one guy who says there's going to be a catastrophic flood if the library is built, and he just gets dismissed as this crackpot. But his argument is that he's basically a scientist, and he basically says all these trees that are being cut down for paper. We love books. We love books. Everyone loves books. Books are wonderful. Theo is like, oh yes, books are great. Isn't it great that we can make paper from trees now? And but this guy says, listen, all these trees you're cutting down for paper, all the roots of the trees are what stabilize the soil and all these other things, and you're deforesting. This deforestation is happening on all of our mountains and our hillsides, and there's going to be massive catastrophic flooding if all these trees are cut down to build the library and all this. So I was wondering, what was your reaction to that? If you felt that was one of those moments where you felt things got a little too modern for you, or was that something where it kind of resonated in the sense of placing a seemingly modern problem in a more agrarian setting?
No, no, I didn't feel that way about that. I'd also feel like this third act of the series now, when the three of them are in the liaison like faculty, um, because the role of that part of the Kafna is to be that like outward facing person involved with the expansion of libraries to the general public, they are going to be like faced with these sorts of conflicts of interest of like convincing people. Um uh so yeah, I think it just kind of goes back to a lot of the other conversations that do get brought up in the series where there's not an easy answer to it, but like the different perspectives that come into play kind of just make it like interesting tidbit within the world building of the series and the details that it puts into everything related to the Kafna. Like everything is very thought out. And I also feel like because of the trio that we have joining in this
Mm,
division, we have Theo, we have Olga, who's like very close with him and very upfront. She's very perceptive. And then we also have Kiraha, who is actually like the undercover agent within the group of in the mass society. Her perspective we see is going to be, I think, the contrast to Theo. I think in this part of the story, uh, yeah, I think it's a very interesting trio to have together.
I
I know
agree
they
with
had the
that.
scene beforehand, but when they were being tested and watched by the rest of the liaison office, who are kind of like, in some ways, like the creepiest like arm of the division. There's a lot of machinations and blunt personalities involved, showing that you have to be to take on that part of the role. So yeah, I know that they were being tested, and she was the like opposing voice to Theo's point of view. So I think we're just going to see a lot of that happening in practice more in this third act of the story now, and then maybe seeing how what is going to happen to Kiraha, more revelations with her. Is she going to be changed, quote unquote, by Theo? I don't know. There's a lot that could happen in this
Yeah,
stretch of the
I agree
story.
with that, and I think it's also just a reflection that the series takes a nuanced view of issues like this. It's not a black and white issue. It's not a black and white situation, and by no means is Theo shown to be always right either. You know, so also I would say Kiraha. Just a brief mention of this is she's not totally unconnected to the book with no name either. She has a certain connection to that angle in the story as well. So yeah, another interesting mysterious character. One of the most mysterious characters in the series, I would say, is Kiraha. But I also loved Olga. I think she's a lot of fun. She's another mixed race person, and she's one of the people around whom I think Theo is like most comfortable and at ease. Um,
Hmm.
he doesn't have to try. He doesn't have to put on any airs with her because they're just like totally people ship them, but I don't necessarily ship them. I think they're just buds. But
Oh
for the
no,
record,
the ship is Theo. The ship is Theo and Aya.
yeah,
Come on.
I know you feel that way. There isn't a lot of overt romance in the series, just for the record. It's these are all teenagers, so obviously there's bits and pieces of it are hinted at, but it's there's not a lot. All right, before we jump on the recommendations, I just want to get your quick response to one final question. Why do you think this series is pretty popular? It's I think it did it win the Manga Tai Show. I know it was at least nominated at least twice. It sells quite
I think it was
well.
nominated.
Twice, I think. I could be wrong. Why do you think it's not gotten an anime? Do you think the politics of the series and the way it does cut against the grain of mainstream Japanese kind of social thinking is the reason why it hasn't gotten an anime? Do you think maybe people are a little scared of the artwork, which is pretty demanding? What do you, if you just had to speculate, why do you think the series has never gotten an anime?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to say. Maybe it is a bit of both of them. I don't. I think there is room for a series with this perspective to exist as an anime. I'm sure it would. I don't know if that would hold it back completely. Um, and but I do think it is quite like a big beast of a series in terms of how it could be adapted, I suppose, and like what gets included and how far it gets into the story. I do think the first act, which is 3 volumes, would be perfect for like a one core anime, and then you could obviously go further beyond that. But like the story of Theo meeting Sedona and everyone initially, and then going to the capital, and then doing the exam, and then how that all comes together. I think those are some of the highlights of the entire series for me still. So I also feel like it would find an audience, especially I think a Western audience, if it did get adapted. I think
Yeah, I
it would
absolutely
yeah.
agree with that. It's been licensed since very early on, actually, in the West because it is a very I
Hmm.
think of it. It does have an art, both an art and a narrative style. And as you say, it's almost more like a fantasy novel than it is a manga. I think it's very Western
Yeah.
friendly. It also, in fact, was nominated for the Harvey Award, which is one of the great Western one of the great Western science fiction and fantasy awards, in addition to the 2 Manga Taisho nominations, which were, for the
Hmm.
record, 2018 and 2025. So, okay, I'm ready to move on to recommendations if you are, or is there anything else you want to touch on before we do that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one last character to touch on that I think is not to end on a negative. I think less successful for me, which is Tay. She's another mixed
Okay.
raced character that comes in, and considering that the mass majority of the cast is teenage girls, I never think that I never got like a weirdness about any of it, how it was being depicted. And then I don't know, there was something about Tay. She's a bit too like uwu cute in a way, paired with her inability to communicate with everyone else except Theo. I don't know. There was something about her personality, and I suppose also the narrative importance that's put upon her as the potential namesake of the series. Whenever it
Yes, yes.
returned to that storyline, I was kind of like, "Oh, she's low key like the the one character from the whole class that I would like spend less time with."
Okay.
I think what we have saw of her and how it is somewhat resolved has been positive on balance, I think. But yeah, that was just one more thing I wanted to touch on because otherwise
Okay.
the rest of the supporting cast is great.
And I do think, yeah, I do think one of her roles in the series is to reflect that Theo has the ability to relate to people that literally no one else can relate to.
Yeah,
He has this, like, that's his superpower, is empathy, which is a superpower in my opinion. And you did mention, we didn't talk about Aya much, but Aya is, she's also very important. She's a Rakta. Rakta is a very, very important, very, very important race in the series, but we haven't really touched on. She's maybe the most significant Rakta character.
mm.
And I think she's one of the closest people to Theo now because they had to work to get there. So, and I think now that they've gotten there, I think that there's something really meaningful to that for them because they did have to work to get to the point where they are now. So I think Aya is great. For the record, I wasn't dissing Aya by not talking about her earlier. I know she's a favorite of yours. I think she's awesome.
And she will be getting
She's
married to him, as she
It
said.
could happen. If I had to ship any one character in the series, she would probably be the one. But again, it's not a big shipping series, but I do think that's the one that makes the most sense. Okay, recommendations. My first recommendation is frickin' read Magus of the Library because it's great. But my actual recommendation for another series, and I have to say, this is one of the hardest ones I've ever had to do. I really had to grind on this because there's just trying to think of series manga specifically that are like Magus of the Library. It's not a long list. I came up with Otoyomegatari by Mori Kaoru, which thematically is very, very different. But I picked it because it, when you can't come up with something that thematically overlaps, just come up with something that's equally great. And Otoyomegatari is just a beautiful. The artwork in Otoyomegatari is, to me, the best of any manga currently being written. Certainly with Vagabond on hiatus, that's the case. I think Magus is top 5, but I think Otoyomegatari is top 1 for me. But I think it is set in Central Asia, and there is a certain sort of the artwork is, it's sympathetic artwork. You could definitely see if I like the one style, I'm going to like the other. They have some kind of very they have some commonalities to it. I also feel like there's a sort of conversational way of narrative flow and plot development. They're both very conversational series where things happen from people talking to each other in a very natural way. Um, and uh, the Young Bride story, Otoya Megatari, is set in the real world. It's historical, but it's set in the real world of turn of the 19th century in Central Asia. But and it's about, basically about young women getting married and families and all that. But there's a lot in common in the way the characters interact with each other that I think there's a truthiness to it that is common to both series. And it's really one of the few series I can think of that I can look at Magus of the Library and say, yeah, you're on the same shelf. You know, quality wise, they're both regal, they're both noble, they're both high end works of art. Magus of the Library is a work of art. Otoyomegatari is a work of art, and there aren't that many manga, even ones that I really like, that I would call works of art. So for me, my pick is Otoyomegatari by Mori Kaoru.
Yeah, whenever you use that as a reference, you know that Enzo is a big fan of
Yep.
whatever he's talking about. My recommendation then is going to be Ichi the Witch by Osamu Nishi and Shiro Usazaki. That is largely because of this approach it has to this world where magic exists, and a gendered approach to this sort of profession that is within it. So whether that be witches or Kafna, it has a male lead who is outnumbered, like in terms of the numbers of all the female witches that are around him. Ichi definitely has a different personality and point of view than someone like Theo does. So they are quite different in that way. And also, Ichi is like that sort of setup used in a battle shonen realm with Magus of the Library. It's obviously very different in what it's focusing on. But I think that there is definite crossover on ideas. They're just maybe explored and fleshed out in different ways.
A good pick, and not one that occurred to me, and very interesting. And I think the gender side of it, the gender politics of it, is a very interesting parallel. A very good pick. I also just want to briefly touch on, and I've managed to avoid mentioning it for the whole time we've been talking. It would have been probably logical for somebody to recommend Witch Hat Atelier here, because the two series are often compared, and there are some obvious overlaps thematically and maybe even artistically to a point between the two. And I've managed, my feelings on Witch Hat are mixed. But I didn't come to this discussion to diss Wish Hat, so I've really kind of avoided going there, and I can't in good conscience make it my recommendation because I just don't think it's anywhere near as well written. But that being said, if you do love Witch Hat, and Lord knows, Witch Hat is a gorgeous series, both in manga and anime form. They're both fantastic in different ways, visually. Um, I would strongly encourage you to give this series a shot because it really does, in a way, I can't say it any other way. It kind of represents like kind of what Witch Hat Atelier could be if the writing was just a couple notches better. I honestly believe that's.
That's so shady.
I honestly believe that's what it is. I think Witch Hat is a incredibly beautiful series with pretty good writing, and Magus of the Library is an incredibly beautiful series with god tier writing. So that's my view on it, and I don't think we should go the whole show and not mention Witch Hat because I do think there is a kind of a natural overlap there that exists.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I haven't read enough of Witch Hat Atelier to comment. Um, I've watched a couple episodes of the anime, and I think it is pretty good. I do think if I was to give it 1 point over Magus the Library, I would say Chapter 1 is better than is better in that
Okay,
series. In fact,
okay.
but yeah, so I cannot speak. I cannot speak to the entirety of the series,
Nor can
but
I, for the
I do
record.
know. I do know that it's technically a higher rated and more popular, but I also 100% agree because there is a similar vein of, I think, progressive point of view and like diversity being part of the series. So if that is something that does appeal to you as a fan of that series, then you will, I think, very much feel the same way with Magus of the Library.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. If you love that one, you should check this one out because I really think you would love it. Okay, it's score time, and I will, with bated breath as ever, let you go first, my esteemed co-host.
Okay, well, I'll put your misery. My
Yep.
score is going to be an 88.
Wow, that's the highest score you've ever given to a series I made you read.
That is
So I,
indeed. And
uh, you really like it, clearly.
I very much do like it. I mean, for context, that puts it within like my top 30, top 40 manga of all time. So I
Yeah.
do get quite strict when it gets further up to those numbers.
Okay.
Yeah, of all the reasons that I've discussed, I feel like it has a very strong point of view. I appreciate the convictions it has for carving out the lane it does within fantasy. Tackles head on some topics that might sometimes feel a bit too modern for what it's trying to do. But like, by God, the fact that it's even having those conversations is refreshing. And I think there's a plethora of side characters that are just very compelling. And then to add on to that, I just love the sheer detail of the world building that
Mm.
convinces me that this world is real. So yes,
Yeah. Okay.
I I
I'm
I did
thrilled.
enjoy it.
I'm thrilled. I'm so glad to hear it because I do love it. I think that's two good ones in a row then that I've dumped on you in Primal Gods and this one. So I think two winners for sure. Um, I'm going to give it 95. It's in my top 20 for sure. I don't quite rank it up there, probably with my absolute, like it's not in the 97, 98 range, which is as high as I ever go, but in that next tier, it's right there. I don't remember what I gave Primal Gods, but I know I was like right in the same territory. And I feel that they're probably for me pretty darn close, those two. I think I might have given Primal Gods like a 93 or a 94. I think maybe I give maybe a slight nod to Magus of the Library just because it does have such a well considered and really passionate perspective on the issues that make us human and the issues that divide us as people. It's really about something in a really, really powerful way. In addition to being a great story, and in addition to Theo just being just one of the great, just absolutely lovable and likable main characters in any manga going, with a great personal story and an incredible cast of characters, most of whom are girls, and a really, really fascinating fascinating depiction of of female characters in an incredibly diverse way that never falls back on tropes or cliches or pandering. And among the many things it does beautifully is really a look at the way men and women and boys and girls interact with each other and how complicated those relationships can be too. So it just does everything really, really well. It's a wonderful series. I hope you guys all read it. I hope you enjoy it. When I recommend a series and someone gives it an 88, that should be the highest possible recommendation that you could possibly have. That means it's got to be doing something right. So, okay. Thank you very much, Samu. It was a long conversation, but it's a manga that gives us a lot to talk about. Thank you very much
It does indeed.
for this conversation. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. Please like, please comment, please subscribe. That really does help the channel a lot. We appreciate it. And until we meet again, I would say stay invested in fiction because you'll really get a lot out of it. Talk to you later.